Good evening and welcome. Glad so many people could come. The weather is being a little more cooperative with us at this particular time. Last week, when one of our colleagues of our guest speaker tonight was here speaking, Dr. Robert Mueller, it was blizzarding. The snow was coming down quite heavily. It was probably about 56 below, wind chill factor below. And Dr. Mueller was commenting about what an adventure he was having coming to Iowa. This was his first visit. And it is our guest speaker's first visit to Iowa. I'd like to say we're very glad you could be here to share our balmy weather with this evening. I know we all are really appreciative of the rise in temperature, and I hope you can come back and we can show off some of our green cornfields to you when the state is a little prettier. I'd also like to invite all of you to come to a reception in the Campanile Room right after the lecture this evening and maybe visit more informally with our guest speaker. A few words by way of introduction about our guest speaker. He is C.V. Narasimhan and is the Undersecretary General for Interagency Affairs and Coordination at the United Nations. He was appointed to the post de chef de cabinet of the United Nations Secretary General in 1961. He served concurrently as Deputy Administrator of the UN Developmental Program and was responsible for General Assembly affairs. Mr. Narasimhan joined the service at the United Nations in 1956 as Executive Secretary for the UN Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East. Before this time, he held several important positions in the Indian government in the ministries of agricultural and finance. It's with great pleasure that I present our distinguished speaker this evening, C.V. Narasimhan.
I think that Janet had intended to tell you that after making a presentation for maybe 30-35 minutes, I would be prepared to take questions. And it was on her mind to say so, but I think she got a little carried away and forgot to mention it. Now, when I was invited to speak to you by, I think, Mr. Joshi in the first instance and later by Dr. Lowry, I was interested in the subject, limitations of democracy in Asia, and in his letter to me, Dr. Lowry said, so often many Americans operate from the assumption that, one, democracy is a system that can easily be developed in any country regardless of its economic and social structure, and two, that the American democratic model is the most desirable. And he asked me, out of my long experience, to shed some light on the problems facing the South Asian countries in their attempts to create viable democratic institutions. So that is my theme today. Is it possible to create viable democratic institutions in South Asia? And then suddenly I began to ask myself the question, what is South Asia? I had just come from that part of the world. I was on a tour around the world on behalf of the United Nations, and I have been in the Indian subcontinent not so long ago. So I wanted to be clear about the meaning of South Asia. And Dr. Lowry told me that what he had in mind was basically the Indian subcontinent, meaning Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka. And I said to him, perhaps I might throw in for good measure just a brief reference to the situation in Nepal and in Bhutan, perhaps, because geographically they are part of South Asia, and he had no objection to that. So this will be my coverage, the theme being democracy and the geographical coverage being these 6 countries. I might also say that I'm very glad that I chose this particular evening rather than last Friday. When I arrived in Honolulu on my way here, the next morning we heard on the radio about what weather you had been having here. And I was asking myself whether it is going to be at all possible for me to get in here at all. And I'm very glad that I have brought a little of what you might call an Indian summer with me. Janet is just coming. Thank you, Janet. I did announce that I would take a few questions at the end of my statement, which will go on maybe for about half an hour to 40 minutes. Now, I think it might be just as well to start from west to east and to begin with Pakistan. Now, if you look back on the situation since Pakistan was created in August 1947, you can see that there are 2 or 3 events that took place there which constituted, in fact, a setback to the progress of democratic institutions in Pakistan. The first was the sad death of the founder of Pakistan, Mr. Jinnah, who was the first president of Pakistan also, so shortly after Pakistan became a separate country. And I think it was also a great tragedy that the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, Liaquat Ali Khan, was assassinated so shortly after the birth of the new nation. I say this because if you compare the continuity in India of the dominant personality of Nehru, and by Nehru I mean Jawaharlal Nehru, and look at the situation in Pakistan, you can understand the great difference between the two countries and how much of a setback it was that Pakistan had these, the death and the assassination of Jinnah and Liaquat Ali respectively, so soon after they became a new nation. We had, of course, a civilian government in Pakistan up to, I think, 1958. And then there was a military takeover. I think first it was General Mirza, and after that it was President Ayub Khan. And since then we have had a civilian government, but you cannot equate a civilian government with a democratic form of government. Now, you all know what happened during the last 7 years. The elections that were held in the Pakistan of free Bangladesh days, meaning thereby the Pakistan which had West Pakistan, which is the present Pakistan, and East Pakistan, which is the present Bangladesh. And the elections, as you know, led to a result in which the Awami League, which was the dominant political party in East Pakistan, present Bangladesh, got a majority of votes. And there was a fear that there might be an attempt to secede, attempt on the part of East Pakistan to secede from Pakistan. And this led to the military intervention and the takeover of the government by a military government in East Pakistan after the elections had been held, the supersession, in fact, of the democratic institutions. And then you are aware of the subsequent events, the arrest of Mujib-ur-Rahman, the flight of over 10 million refugees displaced persons from East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, into India, especially into Bengal, and the events in November and December of 1971, when there was the fighting between India and Pakistan, and finally, of course, Bangladesh was established as a separate nation. Since then, of course, we have had in Pakistan, in the aftermath of this conflict, to some extent a discreditation, so to speak, of the military government and a return to civilian rule. But during the years of civilian rule, there was an election held, as you are aware, just in the beginning of this year, and the charge was made by the political opponents of Mr. Bhutto that these elections were rigged. And there was a lot of turmoil in Pakistan. And the army found itself in a peculiar situation after the elections were over of necessarily having to support a government in regard to the legitimacy of which there was some serious doubt. And while the negotiations were going on between the government of Prime Minister Bhutto and his political opponents, and it looked as if there might be agreement on holding a fresh election. At that point, as you know, General Zia, the present military ruler of Pakistan, took over. He framed several charges against the former Prime Minister Bhutto. He had promised at one point that elections would be held in October, I think, of this year, and the elections have not yet been held, and it's uncertain now when they will be held. So you can say that in the case of Pakistan, the outlook for democratic institutions is, in the short term at any rate, is not very good. But the long term is another story. No one can tell what happens a year from now. One thing is certain, that whether it is Pakistan or Bangladesh, at some point the military authorities will have to hold elections and to have a government which has the broad acceptance of the people at some point. It is also not clear that the reason for the military takeover in Pakistan was entirely due to the charges against Mr. Bhutto. It is not clear whether there are any other reasons for this. Some of my friends, Pakistani friends, claim that there are other reasons behind this action. It is not for me to speculate. But one thing is clear to me, and that is in the short term, the outlook for viable democratic institutions in Pakistan is not too bright. At the opposite end, on the eastern side, is of course Bangladesh. I traced very briefly in the context of Pakistan the events in Bangladesh from 1970 onwards. But as you know, Bangladesh was formed as East Pakistan with only one common factor between the two, the eastern and the western end of India, namely religion, Islam. But once the two states had joined together as Pakistan, you are all aware, of course, that that the population of East Pakistan was much larger than the population of West Pakistan. It was something like 50 to 70 at one point. And the feeling in East Pakistan was for a long time that both economically and politically, East Pakistan was being exploited by West Pakistan. Most of the rulers were from West Pakistan, and a number of industrialists from West Pakistan came to East Pakistan and established industries there, and they had very considerable influence over the government. And the whole feeling in East Pakistan was a feeling that although East Pakistan was a more populous state, that it was having the poorer end of the bargain. This was the strong feeling. And this is the reason why in the elections that were held in late 70, the Awami League got such a big majority. And this is the reason why the government was taken over by the military authorities in East Pakistan, with the subsequent events of which you are well aware. Now, if one were to say about India that Mahatma Gandhi was the father of the nation, and about Pakistan that Jinnah was the father of the nation, you can say about Bangladesh that Mujib was the father of the nation. And it's a very curious circumstance that during 1971, when he was under military custody in Pakistan, no harm was ever done to him. Although it would not have been very difficult for the military government to have liquidated him and explained that this was done for some reason or other. This never happened. And when Bangladesh was formed, Mujib was released, and he went back as the leader of the new nation, as the father of the new nation, as I said, and formed a government. But before very long, in East Pakistan, or in Bangladesh also, there was a feeling developing against the government of Mujib. But whether that was a popular feeling or not, obviously the military authorities were not satisfied about the way in which the government was being run. And you had the takeover in Bangladesh by the present military government. And Mujib was one of those who was killed in the course of the takeover. The outlook in Bangladesh for democratic institutions in the short run is also rather bleak. But I think there is one important difference between the situation in Pakistan and the situation in Bangladesh in economic terms. Pakistan has a viable economy with a very strong tradition of industry, agriculture, and commerce. It is certainly not overpopulated in the way in which Bangladesh is. And to some extent, I might say that by not having Bangladesh as part of Pakistan, Pakistan today is probably more economically viable than as part of a larger Pakistan, including Bangladesh. Now, if that statement is correct, it means that the economic situation in Bangladesh is rather difficult, and it is. The pressure of population on land is very high, and the growth of population is a rather high rate of growth, and unless and until something could be done to stem the population explosion, so to speak, in Bangladesh, conditions in Bangladesh will continue to be very difficult. But as you know, this is a field where even if there is progress, the results become known only over a period of time. And so the outlook, both in the economic and the political sense, for Bangladesh in the short term and in the medium term is not too good. This is a pity because it's a country which all of us would want to wish well, having got its independence under such difficult circumstances. But the fact remains that the conditions in Bangladesh are going to remain very difficult for the foreseeable future. I am only glad about one thing in this context, and that is that so recently as a month or two ago, the problem that existed between India and Pakistan over the Farakka, the use of the Farakka barrage over the Ganga, a problem which dates back to many years, that this has been satisfactorily resolved between the two governments, between India and Pakistan. Now, before I turn on to Sri Lanka and India, I might perhaps say a word or two about Nepal. In Nepal, the monarchy has always been in a very powerful position, and this you will find is not uncommon. For example, in Bangkok, in Thailand, and I was very recently in Bangkok, the situation is much the same. The king's position is that of a constitutional monarch, but the moral authority that he wields and the hold he has over the people, it's something quite different. It is not that of a constitutional monarch at all, but of the ruler of the country whose word is really respected by all the people and heeded by all the people. And that's the position of the monarchy in Nepal. But in Nepal, we have had no military government. In fact, there was a time when there was a military government in Nepal, and the kings of Nepal were not nearly as powerful as the generals who ran the country. But that was long ago. And the history of democracy in Nepal centers around the two Koirala brothers, the Mandir Pradesh Koirala and B.P. Koirala, his brother. And it's very curious. Today, I picked up a copy of the San Francisco Chronicle, and there is an article about the situation in Nepal, and I would just like to read it because it's a very perceptive article. It's actually a quote from the Washington Post of a couple of days ago. And it reads as follows: a key exponent of democratic rule in Nepal, former Prime Minister B.P. Koirala, has been arrested again following his return home from the United States, where he had been sent for medical care. The arrest of B.P. Koirala runs counter to a recent trend in the Himalayan kingdom. More than 40 political prisoners have been released in recent weeks, following pressure from the United States on human rights grounds, and from the resumption of democracy in India to the south. According to well-informed sources here, delicate negotiations are underway between the former Prime Minister and King Birendra over possible movement towards some form of more democratic rule. Koirala still has a following in Nepal, and his presence in the country, even in jail, is a factor that the king cannot ignore. Koirala, 64, and King Birendra, 29, are trying to reach some accommodation, according to well-informed sources here. Given Koirala's stubborn insistence on democratic processes, observers expect movement in the direction, if there is to be any reconciliation at all, between the two. Koirala returned to Nepal last January following 8 years of exile in India, and was immediately imprisoned on a variety of charges, including inciting armed rebellion. He was abruptly called to the palace in June and told by the king that the royal physicians had found him in urgent need of medical attention for narrowing arteries to the heart. A few hours later, he was on the plane to the United States, all at the expense of the government of Nepal. His rearrest came last month when he returned. Observers speculated at the time Koirala left Nepal that the king wanted to avoid the prospect of an outburst by Koirala's followers should the former Prime Minister become seriously ill or die while in detention. In the background, however, was Koirala's long-time association with Indian leader Jai Prakash Narayan and others, who had just overturned Indira Gandhi in the name of democratic rule. Nepal, situated between India and China, is highly sensitive to outside pressures, particularly from India, through which almost all Nepali imports and exports must travel. While the Indian government reportedly has been correct, quote-unquote, correct, in its comments on Koirala, the former Prime Minister stopped in India on his return and received the outspoken backing of several Indian leaders. He has been criticized vehemently in the Nepali press since his return for having sold out Nepali interests. Now, this is a quote from the Washington Post via the New San Francisco Chronicle. I just wanted to read that to you, and I don't want to comment on it, except to the extent that it relates to the possible resumption, let me use the possible movement towards some form of more democratic rule in Nepal. Now, in Bhutan, the situation is similar to Nepal in the sense that the king is the constitutional monarch and everything is done in his name. But the government is a government of people appointed by the king. And you might say, in that sense, there may be some elected members of parliament. I'm not even sure of that. But the situation in Bhutan is not very different from the situation in Nepal. I now come to Sri Lanka. Here, in my mind, there is no question that democratic rule is in full swing in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, as shown by the recent elections. I have been impressed by 3 or 4 things which happened in Sri Lanka and which are very similar to what happened in India at about the same time. To begin with, in each case, it was the lady Prime Minister who was displaced. Secondly, in each case, there were some very important dynastic aspects. Because if there was Sanjay Gandhi in one case, there were a number of Bandara Naikes and other close relations of the Prime Minister in positions of great authority in Sri Lanka. In both cases, the government had socialistic leanings and had support from the left-wing parties. And in both cases, the results were somewhat unexpected because it was an overwhelming defeat of a government which seemed, at any rate, to political observers, to be very strongly entrenched. Now, the problems of Sri Lanka on the economic front are more manageable than the problems of a country like Bangladesh. They have been able to reduce their population growth rate, although the population has, I think, increased more than doubled during the last 25 years, I think. And the population is now close to 20 million, if I recall rightly. The country has a very strong plantation economy, as you all know, and its foreign exchange situation is dictated by world markets. But by and large, the problems of Ceylon are tractable. They are problems which can be solved, both in the long run and in the short run. Again, with a great emphasis on the importance of family planning as a means of preventing a situation where the population growth runs away with all the economic gains that might be made. But the political situation in Sri Lanka became a little unstable shortly after the present government came in, as you must be aware and you must have seen in the newspapers, because there is a very strong Tamil minority in northwest, particularly in northwest Ceylon. And this Tamil minority had hoped to have a much stronger voice in the government than they actually had, and their situation became somewhat untenable in the new government, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction about this. And I used to hear stories about a large number of the minority community being liquidated and so on. No one knows to what extent these allegations are true. But these allegations have died down, and I imagine that right now this does not constitute a major problem. But it is a problem which exists in the longer term, and in the context of democratic institutions in Sri Lanka, this problem will have to be faced and ultimately solved. I understand that my good friend Ambassador Neville Kanakaratne was here not so long ago. I do not know if he dealt with this problem in his presentation of the problem of minorities. But at any rate, I draw your attention to this problem because it is a problem that affects the prospects for democracy in Sri Lanka. And it's a problem with which the present government will have to come to terms at some point or other if they have not already started taking it up in right earnest. Purposely, I come last to my own country, India. And as you are all aware, there has been a dramatic change in the political situation in India since the beginning of this year. But there are some points that are worth going back to if you want to recall what has happened since June 1975. Now, it is very clear that there are many facts that remain to be established, and there are any number of commissions of inquiry in India now which are examining these questions. For example, the basic question of the legitimacy of the declaration of the emergency by the Prime Minister. This is provided for in the Constitution, but under the Constitution, the declaration of emergency will be by the President only when the Cabinet as a whole has recommended such a course of action. And according to the most recent sort of reports that one has heard in India, this was not the case, that it was a decision taken by the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, on the after consultation with only one minister, the Minister of Home Affairs, and after the President had agreed to the proclamation of the emergency, there was a hurried cabinet meeting, and a full cabinet was not present at this meeting, and this is how an ex post facto approval of the cabinet was obtained for a declaration of emergency which was unconstitutional in the first place. This is the story. Now, this remains to be established, and as I said, with all these judicial commissions now in session, we have to await the outcome of their deliberations and the conclusions that they might promulgate before you can take this to be a fact. But apart from this question mark about the declaration of the emergency, you must remember that even while there was press censorship and a number of people, at one point, at least 40,000 people, were in jail only for their political beliefs and for no other reason, everything was done under the Constitution. And where the Constitution could not provide for certain things, the Constitution was amended. But it was amended by the processes provided for in the Constitution itself. Now, this is something that we all have to remember. In other words, that you can have an interference with the normal process of democracy by using the democratic process itself. And this is a paradox to which I wanted to draw your attention as students of political science. The other thing that's clear to me is that this censorship itself, which was one of the results of the emergency, was also the cause of the fall of the government. The censorship in India, like most things that happen in India, was not very effective. Thank the Lord for that. And especially in regard to foreign news, there was hardly any censorship. And those of us who were reading the London Times or the New York Times got plenty of dispatches from India, and you could wonder how any such thing could have ever come out with a so-called censorship in action. That only shows how effective the censorship was. But that is so far as foreign news is concerned. Internally, my understanding is that the censorship made it impossible for the Prime Minister to be aware of the true state of affairs in the country and the true feelings of the people. And it was in these circumstances that the Prime Minister decided to seek a fresh mandate. And if she decided to seek a fresh mandate, you can be sure that she was confident of getting one. But because of this complete lack of touch with the people and their feelings, this proved to be a serious misjudgment. But I must tell you, even in February or March, when I was talking to my Indian friends, I, of course, being for all practical purposes an expatriate, and in any case, as an international civil servant, not allowed to have or express any views on matters like this, whenever I talk to my friends from India, they always said, yes, the Prime Minister will win, but with a greatly reduced majority. But that's not what happened. What happened was a debacle, an overwhelming defeat, not a reduced majority. And in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is her home state, in the central legislature, not one member of the official Congress party, of which Indira Gandhi was the leader, not one member was elected. And this is a fact. Now you might go back and ask, how did this happen? I think there were two aspects. The first, which were somewhat interrelated, the first was the dynastic aspect to which I referred when discussing the situation in Sri Lanka and Mrs. Sirivama Bandaranaike. To realize the aversion to the dynastic rule that people have, you don't have to go very far. In your own country, in the United States, you have an example. I remember in 1960, this joke was John F. Kennedy from 61 to 68, Robert Kennedy from 69 to 76, and then from 77 onwards, Teddy Kennedy, and then what have you at the end of 8 years? 1984. This used to be a joke in this country. So, the dynastic aspect and the prominence of Sanjay Gandhi, the Prime Minister's younger son, who had no place in the government as such. If he had been appointed a cabinet minister for youth, let us say, or something like that, he would have had at least a certain standing, but he did not have any such standing. And yet everybody knew that he was the most powerful man in the government after the Prime Minister herself. And some people even believed that he was more powerful than the Prime Minister. And the second, curiously enough, I say this because I've been emphasizing in all my references to countries like Bangladesh and so on the importance of family planning. It was the prominence given to family planning by Sanjay Gandhi that led to this result in the elections. There was no question that compulsion, crude force, pressure of every kind was used to step up the pace of male sterilization, for example, in India. And it is such a tragedy because if India needs one thing more than anything else, it's a successful family planning program. It is an even greater pity because without the use of such compulsion and without the use of such force and such crude pressure, the family planning program could have been quite a moderate success. And this whole business has received a serious setback because of what happened during the last year, for example, in this whole field. But there is a tide in the affairs of men and women, and this is how things happened in the beginning of this year in India, with results that were totally unexpected, except perhaps to some Indians who claimed that they knew all along this was going to happen. You call them in your country the Monday morning quarterbacks, is that what you call them? But the position today in India, it's not an easy one, because the present government is a coalition of 5 political parties of varying strengths, with no common political philosophy or no common economic policy. They are agreed on certain things like the restoration of fundamental freedoms and the undoing of those constitutional actions that were taken by the previous government, which had the effect of infringing fundamental freedoms. But besides that, they have no policy as such, and they have still to evolve policy. Now, they have been in power only for 7 or 8 months, and so much of that time has been taken up with an inquest on the recent past and the steps that need to be taken to make sure that such things do not happen again. But in the course of the last 7 or 8 months, the government has still not been able to agree upon a strong economic policy. As you all know, the Prime Minister of India, Morarji Desai, is a very strong character, a very straightforward man, a very respected figure. But one criticism that you often hear about him is his somewhat self-righteous and doctrinaire attitude. For example, in respect to something like prohibition. And in fact, in the olden days, not now, but years ago when he was the Deputy Prime Minister and before that the Finance Minister of India, and before that I think he was the Home Minister in the government of Bombay, he used to be called not Morarji Desai but Moralji Desai because he was such a moral character. I think that he is keeping the government together in spite of the difficulties that I have mentioned. His approach to economic problems is not self-righteous at all, it's very pragmatic. And he has as finance minister my former boss, H.M. Patel, who is a very able man and also a pragmatist. But in a sense, it's a great pity that there is no agreed economic policy and no strong will to carry out this policy, because India has the capacity for taking off in industrial production at the present time. Now, with the restoration of fundamental freedoms, there has been a great increase in the number of strikes and in labor indiscipline generally in India. This was, I think, to a large extent a reaction against the bottling up of the labor movement that had taken place during the previous regime. But it also means that there are serious economic problems ahead arising from this problem of labor discipline. Now, this is a factual analysis to the best of my ability and as objective as I can make it of what has happened in South Asia in terms of democracy and progress towards democracy in these six countries to which I have referred. But looking at the problem from the point of view of a political scientist, I have come to one conclusion, and that is, if you seek a form of government which can work without political compulsion on the basis of acceptance by the people at large, it is only the democratic form of government. It might be that an authoritarian form of government was possible in the last century, but today, even in the most economically backward and politically unsophisticated countries, it is not possible for a long time. And I personally believe that wherever there is authoritarianism now, there will have to be a progressive liberalization and ultimately a form of government, not necessarily the parliamentary form of democracy or the presidential system, but a form of government which is perhaps having a constitutional head like a constitutional monarch, as in the case of Nepal or Thailand, but yet a form of government which has the support of the people at large and which is based on some system of elections and democratic institutions. That is the first conclusion that I draw. The second one is that democracy is an expensive form of government. It is wasteful in terms of man-hours spent in solving problems. It is wasteful in terms of economic production, for example, because in a democratic form of government you cannot outlaw strikes or you cannot prevent the workers from resorting to whatever steps they consider to be proper in the protection of their own rights and their own standards of living. If you want to see what democracy can do in the labor field, you have only to turn to two countries, Italy and the United Kingdom, to see how far they can go when you can have a union leader saying we won't have a strike and everybody goes on strike all the same. It is an expensive form of government. But if you ask me to choose between a somewhat wasteful and expensive form of government like democracy and a more effective and efficient form of government like any kind of authoritarian government, I feel that in the long run, in the short run, there might be a claim for greater advantage on, but in the long run, these claims prove to be false. And I think you have to afford it. You have got to afford it, and you have to have, ultimately, a form of government, whether you want to call it a democratic form of government or not, a form of government which is based on the consent of the people. This is the conclusion I draw. The third conclusion I draw is that the parliamentary system of democracy, such as we have inherited from the British, is not perhaps the most ideal form of government, and I speak here as a political scientist for a country like India. Yeah, that form of government can work well when you have two political parties, basically as you have in England, as you have had in England for so long, and in a sense you have had in this country also. And it worked pretty well during the first 30 years of Indian independence, let us say, because of the Congress Party. which was the party that had fought for the freedom of India and which had for so long respected leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru. But looking at the future, in the light of the present experience, if I were asked to draw up a new constitution for India, I would draw up a different constitution with a strong head, executive head, directly elected by the people, with a great deal more authority than the present constitution provides for the central government, and with a system of checks and balances, no doubt, but with the system tilted in favor of the executive rather than in favor of just the states, the central executive rather than in favor of the states. Because many of the problems facing India today cannot be solved on the basis of state action. They can be solved only on the basis of strong central action. And the central government's writ must run in the states. At the present time, this is not possible for two reasons. The first, of course, is the parliamentary system of government. And the second is the fact that the states have totally different alignments, political alignments in various states. In my own state, for example, we have the equivalent of Ronald Reagan, Mr. M.G. Ramachandran, a former film star, running the government and by all accounts doing it very well. And lastly, whatever the form of government, you need a consensus on economic policy which is acceptable to all sides. And such an economic policy is essential in countries like India, which have great possibilities for industrial expansion, take off, as I said, if only there were a strong consensus on economic policy. But in this regard, looking at the Indian scene, I have been distressed by two or three things. The present government seems to take the present tax structure for granted, and the tax system in India is a mess. We have every tax which is conceivable under any system of government. We have a gift tax so that you can't give it away while you are alive. You have a wealth tax so that you have to pay tax if you have too much money, net worth as it is called. You have a tax on property, landed property. You cannot sell a property without paying a duty on the transaction itself. You have a capital gains tax. You have, withholding of income tax on dividends before the dividends are paid. You have taxes on income. You have taxes on corporation income and on the dividends that are paid after the corporation taxes have been paid. Changes tax structure and provided a greater incentive for the middle class people, and the same is true of India. And then there is a whole question of attitudes towards production and distribution. All the concentration is on distribution, what is called social justice. But you know, you cannot redistribute poverty, you can redistribute only plenty. And so long as the accent is on, the stress is on distribution and not on production, I am afraid we will continue to be a country of very poor people. And then there is the whole attitude of the people towards profit making, which is considered a sin. It's a sin to make a profit. Now, with that kind of attitude, I mean, they always confuse profiteering and profit making. And if you have a return of, say, 20% on invested capital, you are a profiteer. We have also got a monopoly. We have got also a monopoly commission to make sure that there are no monopolies in India. And then we have the basic attitude of the people, which is one of plain living and high thinking, rather than good living and high thinking. As though good living and high thinking are in some manner contradictory and incompatible. I feel that all these attitudes have to be changed, and you need an economic consensus amongst political parties on the need for these changes. Then you will understand why a system like the American system works generally for the benefit of all concerned, and a system like the Indian system does not benefit the poor people whom it is designed to benefit. And here, we must make a distinction between economic democracy and political democracy. I am aware of this distinction. But economic democracy does not mean that you have everybody living at the subsistence level. That doesn't help anybody. And if you want to raise the standards of living, it can only be by greater production, which is then shared amongst the people. And here, you have the problem of democratic institutions as much in India as in Pakistan, for example, and before long in other parts of South Asia. Basically, I believe that certainly two of these countries I have dealt with, India and Pakistan, and with quite a good possibility, Sri Lanka, have the opportunity to make very considerable economic progress within a democratic system if you have these requisites: a strong executive and an incentive for more production. And the third imperative for these countries, all of them, is family planning. This, I believe, is the way in which we can make democracy work in these countries, and I sincerely hope that these countries will have viable democratic institutions in the future, and that we will not have to worry about military governments or military takeovers or emergencies or anything like that in the subcontinent. I thank you for your attention, and I've got some 5 minutes, 6 minutes left in which I'm take questions. Yes, Dr. Lowry? Well, you know, it is very difficult to forecast the future. When I was in Chile about 10 years ago, during the government of President Frey, and when Allende was being elected, I was told, oh, in Chile we have had democracy for 150 years, and whatever might happen in the rest of Latin America, it will never happen here. That is what they said. Now in India, I think successive commanders-in-chief have made it very clear that they are not interested in political power, that they want to be the good servants of the government and to be the servants of the people. But I do not know what they would do if they are pushed to a point when they see the military being used as an engine of oppression. If the military, if the police take care of the political dissidents, and the military are not called in to restore order, you have one situation. But if, as happened repeatedly in Pakistan, the military are called upon to restore law and order in a situation where they feel that they are being used to maintain one political party in power, what they might do, I do not know. But I think we are fortunate in that respect, both in Ceylon and in India. There's a very strong tradition of a civilian government and a respect for civilian authority on the part of our own military leaders, and I hope it may continue that way. And I also hope that before long, both in Pakistan and Bangladesh, we will have a return to civilian rule. Janet is going to ask a question. Yes, sir.
I have three questions. The first was about Pakistan before the separation. The question is, how come someone like General Yahya Khan, with unclear identity and reputation, can take over someone like Ayub Khan? And what is the thing beyond that?
Well, I do not know the internal situation in Pakistan, but you know, every government, I think the feeling was that in the case of Bangladesh or East Pakistan, Ayub had made serious mistakes of policy. This was the feeling, and this is what led to his downfall.
Okay. The second question is that suppose in the first of the Bangladesh formation, when Bangladesh was formed, there was a trend toward Russia, but I think it's not clear if that trend
I think the present government is trying to follow a policy of non-alignment, which was the policy in foreign affairs which Mujib himself wanted to follow. I think they are trying to follow a policy of non-alignment.
Okay, the third question.
They are certainly part of the non-aligned movement. They, for example, the non-aligned summit that took place in Sri Lanka last August 76, it was attended by Bangladesh as a member.
Okay, and the last question is that there's a very also question are about the unclear situation in South Asia, mostly in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And my question is that what's your idea about the future view of the economy in Bangladesh?
Very difficult because of the population pressure. I think the present government is aware of it. I think they are very anxious to make some progress in the population front and the food production front. These are two priorities that the present government has. But as I said earlier, for any result to be visible, it takes 20 to 30 years. And it will be a very difficult time for the next generation in Bangladesh. Yes, sir?
On the economic future of Bangladesh, do you think there is anything as Americans that the American government could do to help that would have be a real ultimate help to the country?
I think if you could invent a more effective family planning device in this country and make it available in large numbers to the men and women of Bangladesh, that might help. But in the field of production, as you know, they have got a monopoly of a product like jute, for example, you see. They have some natural advantages. The country is not short of water. It has a delta, and it has possibilities. But the thing that makes economic gains so difficult to achieve is the growth of population. So that's, in my diagnosis, that's the first imperative of Bangladesh more than any of the other countries of the subcontinent. Yes, sir?
What concrete steps are taken by the present government of India to stem the tide of population growth?
It remains to be seen. As I said before, left to itself, this movement would have caught on more and more. But because of the extreme steps that were taken in the course of last year, in 1976, perhaps well-intentioned, but in the result disastrous, by Sanjay Gandhi, the whole movement has received a setback. And it will be some time before the government is able to frame a new policy with disincentives for large populations and incentives for disincentives for large families and incentives for small families. This remains to be worked out. In my conversations with Indian leaders, which was not so long ago, just about a month ago in fact, they all seem to be aware of the importance of this problem. But what they are going to be able to do about it remains to be seen, because knowing as they do that this was one very strong element in the downfall of the previous government, they are not likely, knowing also that they have to go to the ballot box again in the course of the next 4 or 5 years, to do anything which might imperil their own chances of coming back to power. And this is where, of course, all politicians are the same the world over. The one thing that they care about is re-election. And that's why you hear in this country that things can be achieved in a year when there is no election due. And if an energy policy comes up for consideration by the Congress next year, it is going to be that much more difficult because it's election year.
How could these countries in this area of the world use the United Nations more effectively to help address their problems?
Well, actually, you know, the United Nations Development Program has very, very strong, and the United Nations Fund for Population Activities, both have great interest in this part of the world. And the World Bank, of course, has India as its major creditor. The biggest creditor that the World Bank has in the whole world is India. And so they all are doing their best to assist India, for example, and they'll be ready to do the same, I think, for the other countries in the subcontinent. But in the long run, and this is as true of the countries of South Asia as is true of any part of the world, no country can be helped from outside. The outside help can be a crucial factor. It can supply missing elements in technology, in capital, and so on. But no country can lift itself out of an economic morass, let us say, except by its own bootstraps. And what all these countries require, in my judgment, is a self-reliance and an Operation Bootstrap. On that note, I would like to say good night to you. Thank you.
And I'd like to invite you to join us down at Camp in Yale Room 4 reception.